Welcome to Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel. With helpful travel tips, news and events, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from seasoned and experienced traveling anglers, this is your backstage pass to the world of fishing travel. Waypoints is fueled by adventure and brought to you by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing, a hands-on specialty travel and booking company that delivers the industry's very best insider knowledge, logistical support, and trip preparation. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered. And now your host, Yellow Dog founder and director, Jim Klug.
My guest today is Alec Gerbec, a true renaissance man in the world of fly fishing. Alec grew up in the Midwest, where he spent his summers sneaking onto golf course ponds for largemouth bass and pike. He attended Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, and spent those summers working as a guide on local waters that included the Animas and San Juan. After graduating college, he headed to Bristol Bay, Alaska, to guide for the well-known Enchanted Lake Lodge. He spent 8 summers guiding trophy rainbows in that area, during which time he also became a year-round professional guide and headed to the Indian Ocean and Alphonse Island in the Seychelles. Alec spent several years in the Seychelles, including 3 years as head guide on Alphonse. Recently, he's moved back to the States and settled once again in Colorado, where he now works as the Southern Rockies account manager for Umpqua Feather Merchants. So, Alec, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Jim.
It's good to have you here. We're going to get super nerdy and very scientific today. One of the biggest questions that a lot of saltwater anglers and specifically flats anglers have when it comes to planning a trip is understanding tides and the question of, does it really matter? And if it does, Alec, A, how will different tidal cycles affect my fishing? And B, how do I figure it all out and understand it on more of a basic level? So, Alec, you've guided all over the world, including a lot of years spent in the Seychelles, where the tides are legit and at times pretty big. It's not your typical flats destination over there.
No, it's huge swings in tides, which creates a lot of dynamic situations, water going all over the place and fish moving very quickly.
Well, let's start with the overall general importance of factoring in tides and moon phases when planning a trip. And in your opinion, Alec, and we're going to get into this, we're going to tear this apart here in a few minutes, but in your opinion, are tides the number one factor or perhaps the only factor that people need to focus on when planning a trip?
It's a factor. I wouldn't say it's the most important. There's a lot of elements that contribute to your success on the flats. The fish are always going to be there. It's just where they're going to be. So,
well, that's a pretty good point. And I definitely want us to get into more about the how and the why regarding tides for traveling anglers. And we're going to talk about this. But first, let's review the basics of how tides work. The info that was covered back in junior high science class, all right? And of course, we all probably were taught this, but maybe we weren't all paying attention at the time. So we'll do the 101 review, okay? And just get everybody on the same ground level here. So first off, we know that tides revolve around the gravitational pull from both the moon and the sun. And while the sun does have some gravitational pull, the moon is the winner right here. Due to its proximity to Earth, it has a much, much greater influence than the sun does. Now, the liquid part of the Earth, all right, the oceans and seas that we love to fish, they ebb and flow because of the combined effects of these gravitational forces. Pretty simple, right? The moon orbits the Earth in the same direction as the Earth rotates on its own axis. It takes slightly more than a day, and this is kind of interesting. This will come back into factor. It takes 24 hours and 50 minutes for the moon to return to the same location in the sky. All right, and that explains why the tides move forward roughly 1 hour or 50 minutes each day, and that's important. What else? Lunar cycle. Tell me about that.
So, yeah, one thing you should kind of get a grasp of is what is a lunar cycle? This is the time it takes the moon to actually orbit around the Earth. This happens every 29.5 days. And that is the span from new moon to new moon. New moon to new moon. All right. Yes.
That's the lunar cycle. And when we talk about the cycle, there's 4 stages.
Correct. Yeah. So the 4 stages, we have the new moon. That's when we can't see it. The first quarter moon. This is also known as the waxing gibbous. The full moon. And then the third quarter moon, which would be the waning gibbous.
You sound like a science teacher. You're really good at this. This is perfect.
When your life revolves around that thing in the sky and what it does to the water, you get to know it.
You pay attention. So as the moon orbits us, it creates a slight rise in big bodies of water, the oceans, the seas. It pulls them along. All right, it's our tides. And in the most simplistic terms, when the moon rises, you get what is called a tidal bulge or high tide. All right. Correct. Not to be confused with the waiter bulge. That's totally different. All right. So we got the tidal bulge. This is high tide. Those are the basics of tides right there. And most people pretty much understand how this works with the moon and gravitational pull. Now, everyone listening, you're like, oh man, it sounds like I'm back in science class in high school. So stay with us. All right. So we're going to get through the basics here in just a minute. We're going to get to the fishing and the fishing science in a moment. But let's first... at the risk, I will say this, at the risk of offending any of our listeners who happen to be oceanographers or professional titleists, let's talk about some key phrases and terms that relate to tides, Alec. And if nothing else, pay attention to this, because this will allow you to sound legit the next time you're arguing with your flats guide, or you're back at the lodge after your day on the water throwing back beers. You can bust out a couple of these terms. People will be like, wow, man, this guy knows his tides. This is impressive. So we got a couple terms I want to go over. First one, Alec, flood tide. What is a flood tide?
So flood tide is an incoming tide, a rising tide. This is coming from a low to a high, and it roughly happens in a 6-hour time period.
All right, that's the flood tide, the incoming tide. What about the ebb tide?
This is when the water's dropping. It's falling out from high tide to low tide, also going to happen in a 6-hour time frame.
All right, we got the flood tide, the ebb tide. How about a slack tide? This one seems a little obvious.
So in between, once you've hit, let's say, a low tide, it's going to take a little bit of time for that water to start moving in a different direction back to flooding. So this is also called a lull.
A lull, okay. How about the term tidal range?
So this is how they're going to measure tide. So this is the measurement between the highest part of the high tide and the lowest part of the low tide.
Okay, that's your range right there. Now, here's a term that gets thrown around a lot with anglers, and that is spring tide. Tell us what this is.
Yes.
Is this a tide that happens only during the spring months?
This was actually named, it's in reference to like a spring bubbling up out of the ground. So, it does not have to do with the time of year. And this happens around the new and full moon, where the greatest difference of tidal range occurs.
Now, with spring tides, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more in a few minutes here, but a full moon, okay, because you said the spring tide, it happens during the new and then again with the full moon, okay, 2 different moon phases. A full moon will have the most extreme range. That'll be of the spring tides. That's the largest of the spring tides is during a full moon. All right. And that's because the sun is pulling from one side and the moon is pulling from the opposite side. All right. So the full moon delivers the largest spring tides. A new moon still delivers a spring tide, but it's less extreme, correct?
Correct.
All right. And that's because the sun and moon are both pulling from the same side of the earth versus opposite sides. So that's spring tide. Term you hear a lot. Now, neap tide. What are we talking about here?
Neap tide is going to be very little water movement. This is going to happen on the first and third quarter moons of the lunar cycle.
Yeah.
Very little water movement here.
And so 7 days after a new or full moon, it's when the moon is basically at a right angle with the earth and the sun, and the gravitational forces are basically kind of canceling each other out, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So we've got the spring tide, neap tide. Those are 2 terms that anglers throw around all the time. And we're going to get more into the importance of those 2 and the differences and the pros and cons here a little later in this talk. But here's one. We're going to bust out our hardcore scientific terminology right here. Semi-diurnal tide.
All right. Most coastal areas are going to receive 2 high tides and 2 low tides, which correlate with 1 tidal day, a 24-hour and 50-minute period.
Okay, so it's a semi-diurnal, also known as a semi-daily tide. And that's most areas will get this.
Correct.
All right. And then to get super tricky, we have a mixed semi-diurnal tide. What is this?
So, essentially it's like a semi-diurnal, but the highs, the 2 highs and the 2 lows are going to be unequal heights. So you might have a bigger high tide in the morning and a smaller high tide in the afternoon.
And this can happen for a number of different reasons, right? So, for instance, when the moon is directly overhead of the area you're fishing, all right, you're going to have a larger high tide. So, yes, you're still getting 2 highs and 2 lows within that 24-hour, 50-minute period. but you're going to have one high that's bigger than the other high and one low that's lower, essentially. So that's your mixed semi-diurnal. Now, diurnal tide, what is that?
These are the areas that actually only receive one tide cycle, so one high tide and one low tide in that 24-hour, 50-minute tidal day.
And this gets super confusing, right? So we won't get into this. This is not in most places, but it does happen. And usually this has to do with factors like the depth of water or the actual topography of the ocean floor. It can also, the shape of the coastline, though that can all affect how many tides are coming in. So there you might be dealing with a diurnal tide, one high and one low over that 24-hour, 50-minute cycle versus semi-diurnal where you're getting two highs and two lows.
Correct. And like a stove atoll, for example, on the outside, it's going to get some sort of semi-diurnal. But the lagoon often gets a diurnal tide. It has a very small mouth and then a very broad lagoon. So it takes so long for it to drain or push that it's essentially a diurnal within a semi-diurnal. Pretty unique.
Well, I feel like Billy Madison. I just went back to school here. This is perfect. I'm now up to speed on the science of tides. Yes. And this is perfect. And we've got it understood. We've got it figured out. And now things are easy, right? That's all you need to know as an angler.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Not so fast. So here. And this is I'm going to call on your guide experience right here. So sometimes you look at a tide table. And tide tables are the charts that are published for different areas around the world. And you kind of use that every day to make your plan on when you think you're going to want to be at a certain point for an incoming tide, for that flood tide that's coming in. So you look at the tide table, you've got your plan, and then you get out there and you find that things are off and the tide isn't really doing what it's supposed to do. It's not behaving the way the tide tables tell you it's supposed to behave. What are some of the things that can throw off a predicted tide or impact tidal action overall?
Yeah, well, first thing we want to point out is it's a prediction. So they are stating that this is going to be close, but not exact. And then there's only so many stations that they actually measure the true tide. And then from there, they make predictions in, areas that don't have it, but just over history and what they can tell will be pretty close to what should happen. Some of the things that are going to affect the timeliness of those predictions are going to be depth and broadness of the area you're measuring. The shape of the coastline, the topography of the ocean floor, and also one that is quite surprising is the wind. The wind will hold back that water or push it on very quickly, completely throwing off the time frame.
And that's has to do with the speed of the wind, like how hard it's blowing, but also the direction of the wind.
Correct.
I mean, that could actually keep a high tide from coming into certain areas altogether.
Yes.
Yeah, and that happens quite a bit when you're out on the flats or you're in some of these areas. So, Alec, here's another question for you. Why do you have some places, all right? You've talked a lot about the Seychelles. You've worked there. You know that area well. Fisheries like the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean or other fisheries in the Pacific where you find super large tidal ranges, right? Really, really high highs, low lows. And then you have other areas, like a lot of our Caribbean fisheries, where the tidal swings are much smaller. Tell us about that.
Okay. So like some areas like the Gulf of Mexico and certain fisheries in the Caribbean, Central America, they have a lot of continental land masses that actually inhibit the free flow of the tidal movement. They're creating friction, essentially. That makes the difference. And also, you might have an area that is a broad, shallow bay that receives water from a smaller ocean, like the Atlantic.
Or Ascension Bay,
yes,
Chetumal Bay, places like that, where going back to the Seychelles, you might get a 3-meter tidal range,
right?
Which 9 feet plus between your highs and your lows, it can be massive. And then you go to a place like the Yucatan or other Caribbean destinations where it might be 6 inches.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. So you look at the Seychelles. It's a volcanic atoll in the middle of a very deep ocean that's very broad. That water just comes right in, and it doesn't have to travel over a bunch to hit those atolls. So it rises very quickly.
Huge tidal swings. Yeah, and another example, and I know in Alaska you spent your time in Bristol Bay, but if you look at the sound around Anchorage, yes. I mean, Turnagain Arm in those places, mm-hmm. I mean, you could actually see walls of water rolling across those mud flats when the high tides come in. Yes. I mean, it's crazy to see that. People actually go out and surf it sometimes. Yes. Yeah, so those are some big tides up there as well. All right, so we talked about how the difference of tides, the different terms. You get big tides in certain parts of the world much smaller tidal ranges than others. Let's talk for a minute. Let's get back into your super secret guide knowledge right here. Let's talk about how tides impact specific species. All right. So over your years of guiding in the Indian Ocean and more years that you've spent traveling throughout the Caribbean and fishing a lot of these areas, have you found that all species are just completely dialed into tidal movements, or are tides more important with certain species than they are with others? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the fish are following the water essentially. So all of them are trying to get in that shallow water to feed, if we're talking flats fishing. So yeah, it's going to affect all these fish and how they behave, but they're always trying to eat. That's what they do for a living. So it's just going to dictate where you're going to be able to fish for them. Fish like a giant trevally, he's going to revolve around a tide quite a bit to get onto the flats initially, and then he's going to continue to follow the water. So with like a spring tide, for example, you can wait in the surf line where it's bone dry, and as soon as it's shin to knee deep, he's going to come rushing on the flats, and then he's going to keep going. Whereas a neap tide, he's going to stick right around that same area and feed for a long time because that's as shallow as he can get.
All right. So in general, the answer is tides do impact all fish behavior. Somewhat different between species, and we'll get more specific on that in just a moment. But let me ask you this question, because we're talking flats, but do tides have any impact on blue water species? Obviously we know that they're going to impact the shallow water flats conditions in a lot of these areas. We see it as some areas, as you were saying, they literally go bone dry during a low tide. Then, the tide changes, you get the flood tide coming in, and those fish move up onto those areas that an hour before were literally white sand. Now all of a sudden they're calf deep. The fish are moving in. They're looking to feed. Offshore in deep water, the tidal swing is still happening. But how does this affect how like pelagics and other blue water species will feed and behave? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of theories here. What I noticed, we have a huge blue water operation out there in the Seychelles as well, and we paid close attention to the tides. And in general, we saw lots more current during our neap tides, and that's a result of that water not actually being able to get on the flat, so it's trying to work its way around the atolls, creating these big currents, okay? And then that's also keeping the bait still off the reef, and so those blue water fish, those pelagics, they're going to get nice and tight in that current. They're going to feed nicely. Whereas in a big spring tide, it's going to allow those bait fish to move in a little closer to where those pelagics aren't comfortable. Also, the temperature of water has a lot to do with it too. So when we have these big spring tidal movements, it's bringing warm water off the flats during the dropping tide, and that's going to push blue water fish further out, making them they're harder to find because they're no longer right on that drop off like we want them. So, yeah,
the answer is absolutely.
Yes,
the
definitely.
tides do affect and impact those blue water species, but in a very different way.
Yep.
And like you were saying, there's a lot of theories about kind of how to crack that code and where to find him at any given moment, having to do with current and temperatures and water emptying off the flats, and lots of theories. And let's talk about that for a second, because the one thing that we get a lot in the booking business is anglers call in, they want to book a trip somewhere to the Salt, and they always, of course, start by requesting, dates with the very best tides and the very best fishing. It's like, well, okay, it's a reasonable request. We got it. But the fact is, there's a lot of theories about what, the phrase "the best tides" actually mean. And depending on whom you ask, you're going to get a lot of very different answers. This is something that saltwater guides and anglers are just so opinionated about. You can ask one person, for instance, a successful tarpon guide about their favorite moon and tidal phase, where they find the most success and what they swear by as far as their favorite time to be fishing. And they're going to have their preferences and their opinions. Then you can ask another equally known and just as successful guide in the very same area, and they may tell you something that's completely different. They've got a completely different theory. And it seems to be a little bit all over the place. Kind of depends who you ask.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, what do you think about that?
I mean, yeah, you would talk to my guide team, which consisted of about 20, what their favorite tides are, and they all almost had a different answer. And yeah, it's going to have to do with how that affects your area and what fish are going to allow you to fish for them in that. So yeah, all tides are good. It's just it's knowing where to go. There's always going to be a place to fish for those fish during that moving water period. So whether it's a big water movement like a spring or a little water movement like a neap, there's going to be very good fishing in those situations. You just got to find it.
That's right. And the bottom line, I mean, you start looking around out there and you're going to find a lot of different theories and schools of thoughts. And as you said, you got 20 guides that work in the same place, guide the same waters, and they all have different philosophies and favorites for sure. So I know that a lot of people who are listening to this podcast are hoping to get the final word on this. It's like, great, I listened to Jim and Alex sitting there. I've got it all solved. I got it all figured out. But really the answers are going to vary depending on who you're talking with.
Yes.
So I also love it when during a trip when the fishing is slow for whatever reason, which as we know can happen in the world of saltwater flats fishing. There are guides that love to throw their booking agent under the bus by telling the angler that, oh, well, the tides are all wrong. I mean, that's the reason the fishing's slow. You came at the wrong time. And I hate this. Now, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And of course, we always hear about it when it does. But I've always thought that's kind of a lazy, convenient excuse for not wanting to work harder or not having a better plan. Because when you're a saltwater guide, you don't have the luxury of only working the days where you feel there are optimal tides and perfect conditions. All right. You're out in the Seychelles, you're guiding out there for 8 months. You're guiding every day, every week. You have to guide on springs, neaps, and all kinds of conditions, all types of varying factors, wind conditions. That means that as a guide, you have to have a plan. And this is so key. We talk about this a lot on the show in different ways, but always having a plan. And a complete guide always has a plan for fishing different areas or different species, regardless of the tidal cycle or what's going on.
Yes. The making a plan was the single most key part of having success on the flats with any of the tides. Yes, you can go out there and catch a few fish, but if you really focus on what the water's going to do with the wind direction and follow that water and have some self-humility as well, because you won't knock it out of the park every time. Just keep moving. And you will find those fish, and what you'll find a consistency, and you can start relying on that, but it's never going to be 100%. So yeah, as a guide, it's easy to blame something on the tides, but really that move we made it didn't work out. Move on. There are fish out there, because you'll talk to another boat that's maybe 500 yards away and they're in the middle of it. So yeah, it varies. You got to make a plan and try to follow through with it as much as possible.
Well, I love how you say, the fish are there, and being a complete guide really means learning your area, learning where those fish are going to be found, different conditions, different tides, and being able to move. I love going out with a guide where they say, okay, good morning, welcome to my boat. Here's our plan for today. And they put it out there and they say, okay, based on what we think the tides are doing this morning, we're going to start here. Then we're going to move up towards the apex and we're going to go in here. And then we're going to move off and maybe do a surf walk here for the afternoon. And it's a plan.
Yes.
It can adjust and change based on what you find over the course of the day. But, you're always kind of breaking it down and saying, look, we're out here for 8 or 10 hours. The tides are going to be constantly changing. We're going to change with them. We're going to adjust and adapt and, continue to move around and find fish. And that, again, that's a complete guide right there.
Yeah. When you hear your guide kind of introduce the day with a plan like that, that means he's been looking into it and looking forward to it. You get a lot of requests on the water when you get on the boat and you say, today I just want to focus on this fish. Realize there are definitely windows throughout that day, but he's just trying to maximize the time following the water to have success throughout the day on a number of different things, and then eventually getting to that one thing you are after. So, soul searching for that trophy GT all day, you're going to have some awesome windows, but you're also going to have some very slow times. You just got to realize that it's the tide's going to affect it, and
always changing.
That's
right. Well, you mentioned GTs. Let's talk about a couple specific and key species that people really do love to focus on. Let's start with GTs. Do you have a favorite tide?
I do. And it'll be surprising to some, but it's a neap tide. The reason why is I have time to fish for these things. Like you heard before, the tidal swing in the Seychelles is giant. So on a spring tide, you have to be at the right place at the right time exactly. And then once that water gets past that level, you got to hop in your boat and move again, and then move again and move again. And hopefully it works out. You're chasing the water. Neap tide, you can set up, you can spend all that time actually fishing an area instead of traveling, hoping. So, I love a surf walk. I love watching those fish surf in on waves. But if I can now pull my skiff out there and watch the waves slowly and watch, all of a sudden a shark come in with 3 or 4 fish, and they're taking their time. They're not rushing up the flats. That's pretty awesome. I like being prepared instead of surprised.
I like that because so often you hear, GT's got to have a spring tide. And the key thing, as you just said, is the window can be productive, but it can also be small. And when you're talking about a 2, sometimes a 3 meter tidal swing, where you're knee deep, 1 minute, within an hour, you might be neck deep. And so you're just getting pushed around.
Yeah. You'd be running if you were knee deep in the spring and no surf. It happens very quickly.
Yeah, you don't want to be caught in the wrong place with your boat, across the channel, 300 yards away. You're trying to move upstream. It's like wading a fast-moving river.
Yeah, there's, a couple big creatures around, too. There's nothing like swimming back to your boat, knowing that, a tiger or a bull can be on the flats with you at the same time. So another reason I like being on my skiff near the surf.
There you go. Yeah, it keeps it a little spicy. So another very tide-dependent species we hear a lot about are permit. And we do know that permit typically love the flow of water across their back. That they're generally an unhappy fish, but when they are happy, it's usually because there's a flow across their back. Talk to us a little bit about permit and favorite tides for permit.
Yeah, so as we all know, they're a very aware creature. They're trying to get as shallow as possible to feed, to stay away from predators. The tide's going to allow them to do that. It's, with the topography of the flats coming from the reef up to, the highest part of these flats, the permit got to find that safe zone. So a place like St. Francois, there is a lot of different stages of tide throughout that place. Just as the water flows in the main channel, it fills up that lagoon. It's hard to explain, but you follow the water up and you'll have permit fishing for the next 3 hours of them just coming onto the flats. Whereas a place like Poivre, as you now have seen, you want a neap tide because there's not much water between the surf zone and the land. And so this gives them a nice shallow zone that they can hang out in, and you can target them for a long period of time. Whereas with the springs, like on St. Francois, you're constantly chasing them up the atoll to get
much larger window.
Yeah,
that's right. Now, how about bonefish?
Bonefish, they're also trying to stay away from the predators, and they're trying to get skinny as possible.
They're looking for food, but they are food too.
Yeah, they are the number one snack on the flats, especially in the Seychelles. So, bonefish are always trying to stay in cold water and the shallowest water possible. So, they're very tidal dependent. But that happens both with spring and neap tides.
And one of my favorite things about bone fishing in a place like Alphonse is you can go to certain areas of the atoll during the slack tide before things have turned, and you'll see them staged by the thousands.
Yes.
And they're all together in these schools that you can't even believe how big it is. And they're waiting. They're waiting for that water just to creep onto the flats enough where then the assault waves of bonefish begin.
They're essentially running away. Yeah, they're trying to either get up or get down. So they can get to feeding and stay safe, because once they get in that deep water, there's a lot of different things that are after them.
Well, the thing about both spring tides and neap tides, my takeaway in listening to you, Alec, is that there are pros and cons to both, no doubt about it.
Yes.
And there isn't one that's necessarily better than the other. They're just different. They offer different opportunities. And I think, spring tides get a lot of love due to the thought that the high water movement and the big swings will get those fish going. And it does. There are scenarios, as you've just pointed out, where the fishing can be better on neap tides.
Correct. One thing with the springs is the timing of which the low tides happen. Often you can get a low tide in the middle of the day or late in the day. And that's going to not only heat up those dry flats now for when your water comes in the afternoon, it's going to be really warm water, but it's also going to delay the amount of fishing you get to do in the afternoon. Water temperature has a lot to do with how happy those fish are. So neap tides, they're going to keep water on the flats and never allow it to get super hot in a lot of situations.
Well, pros and cons. I mean, that's the thing you have to understand as an angler, for sure. And again, there's always going to be an opportunity. You're just going to have to shift your game plan throughout the course of a day or the course of a week, for sure.
Yes.
All right. And again, that gets back to fishing with the right guide. No doubt about it. So we talked a moment ago about tide tables, kind of the holy grail for guides in a lot of saltwater places. Where can people find accurate, specific information on tides? How can you research this prior to a trip or when planning a trip?
Yeah, what I would say first of all is reach out to guys like you, Jim, to talk to the lodges to see what tables they're using. Within an area, there's a bunch of different locations they're pulling tidal information from, and then they'll have adjustments that they have found to be most accurate. So at first, getting a handle of which table they're using from the actual destination that you're fishing at, and then go from there.
All right, so we're gonna sum all of this up, all this great knowledge that you've just thrown at us here. The $10,000 question, Alec: how should traveling anglers incorporate tides into their saltwater trip planning, and what can anglers do to maximize their chances for great fishing in any saltwater destination? What's the magic bullet, Alec? What's the answer?
Yeah, so definitely knowing your tides will allow you to know how you're going to fish. Big spring tides, you're probably going to be moving around a bit more, maybe on your feet a bit more. It's a hard question to really answer, but just also being aware of the weather. That's going to have a lot to do with your success. If you can't see the fish, it's going to be hard. I don't care if you have the perfect tide or not. It happens all the time. So, and
what you said back at the beginning of the program, I think what the first question I asked you, you said tides are a factor.
Yes.
They're not the most important factor or the only factor, but they are one factor, along with wind and weather and visibility and temps and all of these things. It's one factor, but certainly not the only one.
Correct.
And of course, the best way to deal with it is just book a trip for 2 weeks, and then you'll see all the tidal cycles, right?
We see that more and more, and it makes so much sense because, you get the best of both worlds. And you're eliminating some of those factors in your short little time frame that you're hoping everything's perfect. Nothing's ever perfect. So,
not in the world of saltwater fishing.
Never.
That's for sure. Well, the final takeaway, I guess, then is, when you're planning a trip or looking at dates, check tide charts, research them where you can, look at the moon calendar, and whenever possible, and even if this is kind of last minute, check a wind forecasting app too, because as we talked about, wind can have a big impact on what tides are actually doing versus what they're predicted to do.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Thank you, Jim.
You are a wealth of information on this and great stuff. We really, really appreciate it. And that is it for this episode of Waypoints, the podcast that is 100% dedicated to travel, adventure, and exploration. Be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com to plan and research your next fishing trip. Sign up for newsletters and new podcasts. And of course, stay up to date on the latest travel news and developments. Join us for our next episode of Waypoints. And remember, regardless of the moon phases, tides, or conditions, get out there and fish, because no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more trip updates, travel news, expert advice, and adventure profiles.